Hey, good to see you all back fresh for the new year. Welcome to the lecture series. Thanks all for coming. Tons of people on the stairs. Thank you for coming. Welcome all. This is the College of Architecture and Design lecture series, if you've never been here before. Tonight's lecture is supported, I should say, by the Robert B. Church Memorial Lecture Fund. First, I just want to say a word about the lecture series at large. We have, I think, again this year, a truly amazing edition of the series. It's a tremendous amount of hard work to put all this on, and many people make that happen. On behalf of them all, I just want to say that it's a matter of pride and ambition that I think this series registers as one of the best available in the country for schools of architecture. I want to say thanks to key people that make it happen. The committee is myself, I chair that committee, and Jennifer Ackerman and Gail Fulton and Diane Fox, who facilitates all the amazing exhibits over in 103. So if you haven't seen Bryan's work over in 103, please do so on your way out, and then come back the next day and the next day and the next day after that, just to soak it in. Also want to say thanks to the staff that facilitates all this. That's Jenny Flatford, Amanda Johnson, Thelma Hilton, and Florence Graves, who do a ton of work for all this stuff to work. And I just want to say thanks also to Jason Young, as always, for their support and care for the culture of the school at large. Jason's actually doing a lot of work on the series this year, and it's invisible, so thank you. Over the last couple years, we've been fortunate to have guests like Keller Easterling, Nicholas DeMoncho, Liam Young, Fiona Raby, Jeff Mena, Jimenez Lai, Mark Smount, Laura Allen, Shannon Mattern, Paul Lewis, Craig Dykers, Kazio Sejima, among many, many others. And as a testament to the quality of the series this year, we're starting tonight's episode off with a bang, I think. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Bryan Cantley to you all tonight. Bryan's a guest I've been looking forward to having on the series since I first started organizing this. Bryan's a Los Angeles-based designer at his own studio called Formula. He's also a professor in the Department of Visual Arts at Cal State University in Fullerton. He's lectured widely at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I cannot see anymore. The Bartlett School of Architecture. He's lectured widely at the Bartlett, at UCLA, at SciArt, among many others. His work is featured in the permanent collection at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. His first monograph, titled Mikudzu, A New Rhetorics for Architecture, was published in 2011. By the way, if you're looking for a copy of that, I found one on Amazon today for just over $1,300. He's been featured in AD's Drawing Strength from Machinery and Drawing Architecture. Bryan's a prolific maker and drawer. He's part of a discourse about experimental architecture. But I think even that description is somewhat anemic when we actually encounter Bryan's work. His drawing practices are like exercises in speculative linguistics, and his drawings are rich with layered ideas and invented visual languages through which to express them. It seems he takes it as his task to translate between the verbiage of concepts formed in the brain and the ineffable but often more nuanced sensibilities that spill out of the hands. A kind of making sense of space and ideas through the language of drawing. I think it can be no coincidence that Hurricane Florence timed her arrival in the southeast with Bryan's own arrival. We could speculate that perhaps the two supernatural forces are attracted to one another, or maybe they're necessary to offset each other. But in any case, I think we should count ourselves lucky to be in the room tonight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bryan Cantley.
Well, it's always interesting to hear these kind of precursors that happen to lectures. They're I think, much more interesting than the lectures themselves. Thank you for such a great introduction. Also, thanks to Mark for doing the heavy lifting on the lecture, and for Diane for pulling together the exhibition. That's been kind of an interesting little logistical battle. So hopefully you get a chance to see some of the work. I've got about an hour. I'm going to talk about sort of a condition of classificationing, kind of trying to position my work somewhere between architecture and its representation. It's a condition that's called postliminal fuzz that I'll go over in just a minute. And I want to kind of talk a bit about how I attempt to classify several of my work typologies through a filter of kind of a handful of projects and drawings. And I do this internally to kind of understand how I might navigate and curate the body of work. And I think it gets a little dangerous when you try to classify. I think you potentially start to reduce one's work to a taxonomy. But it kind of serves as an internalized cataloging system. And then I think, when I start doing these exercises, I always run the risk of overclassification or probably improper classification. But I think that's kind of part of the beauty of the experiment, kind of the wading into the unknown, if you will. And I think ultimately what I'm talking about is simply, it's just language. Language is kind of, it's systemic. It has a natural grammar. Our internal grammars, of course, vary from person to person. I think this is how each of us start to kind of think and start to categorize. But each of our grammars are somewhat similar enough to use to understand each other. Otherwise, you have kind of the Tower of Babel effect. And so for me, it's always really, really interesting, really quite challenging to try to frame my work for a lecture. Inevitably, I discover that I've misclassified my work. Or that there are new typologies that are emerging as I'm starting, that I wasn't aware of when I'm starting to lecture. Or a lot of times that it was kind of a mistake in the first place, and I really don't know how my work reflects any degree of classification. And it's maybe better to sort of simply do one of those current project lectures. But I think one of the reasons that I decided to make the effort of self-classification is because it's odd and sometimes diverse output sets from my studio. So obviously there are the examples of the kind of the experimental drawing, although I'm not really certain that might classify as a typology. And then there are the hypothetical and experimental works, kind of projects that attempt to solve a more specific architectural problem or critique a condition within the discipline. And I think these are maybe kind of less known. Interestingly enough, themselves, they typically generate artifacts that are more commonly associated with my experimental drawings. And so what I found myself doing over the years is creating a lexicon and grammar to describe kind of emergent conditions that I discover somewhere in the middle of a given study. And I think even though that there are already sufficient terminologies for architectural prototypes, I find the system of inventing this terminology to be more in keeping with the spirit and essence of what I do, which I think if you boil it down is really just an act of invention. So then the act of inventing vocabularies and classification systems and languages becomes sort of a similar act as that of inventing the architectural experiments. And I don't know if it's really important outside of my studio, but I think it helps me as a maker to understand not only the rules through which my work must abide, but also to understand that within the envelopment of categories, I'm forced to comply with the nature of those searches. We were talking a little bit about this in some of the studios today. So this practice of classificationing locates itself somewhere between a masturbatory exercise and a method of actual academic inquiry. And I've learned to become okay with that over the years. So with that, I want to talk about just a kind of a series of projects that may or may not, hopefully successfully fall into these neat categories that I've invented for myself. And I think it's important to state that the conversation that I have with myself about these categories are quite helpful to establish these kind of definitive splinters of my experimentation. One of which is the condition of the Lyman. I mean, it's a transitional threshold between two fixed spaces or states and kind of a rite of passage or between two dissimilar spaces in architecture. So it's basically a threshold condition. It's an intellectual or emotional space between other types of tangible spaces. And so it basically becomes an examination of the in-between. I consider liminal space to be a discontinuity that makes the occupants question or at least become aware of their surroundings and the awareness of the threshold. In human physiology, the interstitial space between organs and tissues is called the third space. Fluid sometimes collects here if the body is in a state of malfunction. That space is kind of per se designed to house those entities, but it also serves as an overflow container when breakdown occurs. And I think on that kind of merit, interstitial space is not really a new term in architecture. Liminal space within drawing is quite common, though I think most of the time we've been encouraged to ignore or kind of erase or edit out its presence. And when you start to define an architectural drawing as a documentation of elsewhere, of a thing's representation, then this third space starts to become supportive at best. It's often dismissed, it's often removed, or at least it's not critical in the ability to understand the object being defined. So I want to kind of walk you through the phases of liminality. So the first is the recognition that there's a difference between representation and drawing, the documentation versus the exploration. The second would be the extraction of the drawing as an autonomous entity. And the third would be the establishment and documentation of the drawing's construction and post-narrative, what I'm calling the liminal fuzz. So the sequence of drawing this might look something like, first you draw something, an object. Second, you establish the identity or character of that object through the completeness of the drawing. Third would be the representation of the new object, which is the drawing itself, through this versus the subject of the drawing. The third would be the extraction or the construction of the liminal condition, which leads us to the last one, which is the establishment of what I call postliminal fuzz, which are basically the artifacts and the notations and the new conditions of residues generated within the liminal condition. So it's kind of a post-drawing drawing, if that helps you understand it a little bit better. And so I started looking at the structure of music, and I realized that there's a series of sequence considerations that are worth exploring. If you look at the occupancy of music, I think it occurs at three different yet semi-connected areas. The first is graphic notation, which is the world of the writer or the composer. The second is the world of it's the performance, which is the world of the artist or the musician. And the third is the oral receipt, which is the world of the listener. And then kind of from that, I started to extrapolate that I suggested that there's that architecture exists at these multiple levels as well. I don't think any is more important than the other, but I think they all provide a larger access to the greater whole. So the first would be graphic notation, which is the world and the language of the designer or the architect. The second is the performance or the construction, which is the world of the builder or the fabricator. And third would be the occupancy, which is the world of the viewer or the inhabitant. Which led me to a couple of questions, and my studio is kind of defined by not so much giving answers, but by asking questions, such as does the occupation of music occur somewhere between the writing of the notes and the printing of the music and the musical performance? There's a large kind of world of overlap between those conditions that kind of intrigues me. And then questions like how does recording and playback inform or deform music's spatial theory? And then, of course, I started to ask if there's an architectural equivalent, or should there be? Are these two disciplines analogous in those specific points? I think with most of my drawing work, that there's a condition. This condition is a situation where I attempt to coordinate and articulate all of those systems of interface or experience, but I kind of try to do them simultaneously. And I think you can extend that previous logic to suggest then that the architectural drawing, the residue of the artifact, might exist in a similar trio of layers. The first being the layer of impregnation, which is that of the drafter. The second is the layer of consumption, which is that of the voyeur. And the third is the layer of occupation, which is the layer of cerebral inhabitancy. And in my exploratory drawings, I've been attempting to synthesize these three layers into a single page event. It's one that speaks of referencing not only building technologies and conditions of occupancy, but the hidden layer of graphic notation, and I'm attempting to do of all these kind of simultaneously. It's this section of occupation that I think begins to explore the opportunities and overlaps of reading and the implications of occupancy within an architectural drawing. Many architects deal with drawing as a vehicle to describe spatial residence, obviously. My work also attempts to harvest the type of information and it's what I call experience notation that's not usually investigated. It tends to stay in the background of drawings, and I tend to try to bring them into in the realm of the invisible, and I'm trying to make that information visible. So my lecture is kind of divided up into 4 small sections. The palimpsestuous relationships, which are sort of a condition of drawing on top of other drawings. The second is the taxonometric drawing, which is a context-generative condition. It's a fairly new condition in the studio. The third is the post-generative drawing, which is basically drawings that are constructed after a project is complete. And the last one is what I'm calling a datascape, which is just a couple of projects that incorporate drawing data back into the architectural suggestion. So the first section, palimpsest relations, drawing things on top of other things. So the traditional palimpsest denotes, it was an original writing that has been effaced, edited to make room for a later writing, but which traces of the original remain. So in that case, I think it's a drawing that's been altered to accept a later drawing, which for me becomes as much a metric of chronology as it does anything else. It's kind of in between these two entities. So this series of drawings, it's a 2-space experiment. I was looking at 2 scenarios that attempted to inform and deform a given set of constraints or contexts. The first space was that of organized religion, which I consider to be one of the first social networks. And then the second was the condition of the drawing. So I've started noticing an emergence of several kind of human interference patterns as social media starts to expand into everyday consciousness. The power of the draw of social media being kind of ironically being connected, the power of personal statements and videos that show perhaps only one side or one view of a particular instance, but that are immediately accepted as a truth by so many, so quickly. It kind of deals with the desensitization of society through the saturation of what I'm going to say is truth on call. And so I started to question the role of maybe kind of younger people, especially raised in the age of the social media appliance, what an idea of higher power might be, and where the truth for searches might be located. So it seems that there's kind of a movement towards a new type of quasi-religious experience, and then therefore a quasi-religious kind of space. So I started to question the role of the documented and presented organized religion within this multi kind of space. So and within that I started looking at media as itself being a drone, which is a condition of pure social and architectural media, a system that would have to be affected by the awareness or the presence of the camera. You are all familiar with reality TV, and we sort of have to suspend the belief that the camera and the production crew are not an active part of the scripting and therefore the presentation, which always seemed kind of odd to me. So then this I guess it's a technology delivery system, or the presence of the drone becomes it's a highly political and I think therefore architectural space. So there's a correlation to this all-knowing and watching entity in religion that's not lost in this experiment. So the idea of drone politics is as much a drawing device as I might use my pencil for. And because of the work I do with an architectural media, I start to question the sanctity of architectural drawing. We're at a time where distortable media is, I think, what I'll call the beverage of choice. So the combination of these two entities, the proposed religious structure and the sanctity of the architectural drawing, seemed a really good place to start to kind of tie these together. So the idea of drawing on top of an existing print, the artifact or the subject matter, in this case was a technological broadcast hub, kind of placed within an ancient religious center, which itself was kind of a broadcast device. I think it started to challenge, I don't know, some of the accepted stereotypes with new prototypes of what is real and what is implied. And it started to kind of bring about the condition of the importance of the idea of myth of place and the plausibility of information distortion when you're looking at spaces that in which actual events are transpiring. So then the architectural drawing, I think for some time, can be argued has become a sacred object, certainly at least within given curatorial circles. So the rendering, or this idea of a finished image, which I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with, has reflected a condition of conclusion of sorts. I guess maybe not in the too distant past. So I find it interesting that the conversation of design, and then therefore the conversation of possibility, begins to erode as soon as your final printed image arrives in the studio. Typically, a student would not use the finished condition of the render to physically draw upon. If needed, you redraw, you render. Just as I imagine you guys as students are not printing 3D prints on top of old 3D prints, although I think there's an interesting topic for a studio there. We'll save that for another time. So then the heliotype print, which are the images that I'm drawing upon, it's somewhat of a revered object. It's processed as a finished image. It's sold to collectors who wish to possess what we'll call an esteemed architectural object. And I'm going to argue that the condition of print itself is suggestive finality. It's a termination of architectural thought and a termination of intent. Even though it continues on as a subject, it terminates itself as a malleable object. So we broadcast the subject, the idea, through the conclusion of the object or the print. So my proposal was to devise to challenge forms of architectural, cultural, and religious normalcy. I think since a lot of my work looks at the threshold state in between entities and their situations, I thought that this kind of redefining might lead to an interesting conversation about what is sacred, as well as what is ubiquitous and an extremely established network of kind of social media events. And it also started an interesting conversation in my studio about faith within an invisible system of organization and distribution. And it also, I think, very temporarily makes us start thinking about the idea of cloud entities, both in terms of cloud entity as heaven and cloud entity as a data storage reservoir. Both are reservoirs of identity, if you will. And then I started thinking about the nature of the delivery mechanisms of those cloud structures. So in terms of media, it's important to note that the physicality of these objects, and these are hand-drawn constructs on physical prints, are very important in their classification. There has to be an analog entity. The physical act of making a drawing upon another drawing is more important than the production of a legible rendering. The object within the space, the kind of checkerboard intervention, the supplanting of this device is quite important because it provides a necessary juxtaposition, but the production of the artifact is key in whatever its ultimate truth is. Typically, drawing upon a drawing is a taboo component of method. And this is the element that challenges the norm of rendering, and the objective is to remove its finality as an object, if you will. And although these projects do start to show, there's some similar characteristics to collage, the typology involves more the construction of media directly upon the original, not kind of just the cut and pasting of an imported image into another drawing, which is so easy to do in the digital realm. I think there's something really sinister, and for me then quite seductive, that the fact that somebody other than the original draftsman or architect is altering the graphic product of her labors. I find that kind of really intriguing. And so in this case, the original artifact, the drawing, has to be physically defaced. A new layer of information has to be introduced to assure its reading as kind of a rogue artifact. And I think to be able to frame an argument about postliminal space, which is the space between architecture and its media, as well as the space of the architectural drawing, the drawing itself has to be recognized as a physical entity. So in this sense, this project has become a kind of tattoo event, where I'm using the surface as a drawing as an impregnable condition, and then the alteration of the original creates a condition both of simultaneity and singularity, and I think it arguably enters a conversation about the viability or the sanctity of either of them. I think it starts to speak about the future of a drawing, or perhaps the rewriting of an architectural history, which I think is a seductive kind of idea. And yeah, I've had conversations that I suppose I could probably presented these architectural inventions on like the page of a holy book or a song hymnal, and I still may attempt that, but it's only addressing half the equation. Ultimately, drawing upon the sacred architectural object becomes the impetus behind these projects. Otherwise, you're not really challenging the typology of drawing as a malleable context. So having done these exercises, we were talking about it in the gallery earlier, there's also a new typology in architecture's representation of itself. It's what I'm calling the analog mented reality. So if you look at augmented reality as an interactive experience of kind of a real world environment where the objects that reside in the real world are augmented by some sort of synthetically generated perceptual information, this overlaid sensory information, it can either be constructive, so that you're adding something to the natural environment, or it's destructive, such as masking something out in the natural environment. It's kind of seamlessly interwoven into the physical world so that it's perceived as an immersive aspect of the real environment. I'm proposing that this is the analog version of augmented reality. We're taking the print as the given condition of truth, and we're both introducing, adding, and we're blocking masking information to produce a new set of kind of artificial synthetic condition. So I guess I'm going to challenge that this type of palimpsest creates a new typology nomenclature within our discipline, possibly. It's important to note that these ideas are really meant to reside within the realm of drawing. These are not meant to be built or even buildable interventions. I think for me that argument becomes very limited very quickly. So the manifestation of this postliminal fuzz that I talked about before, I think the drawing is really the only place where this crops of this fuzz can be start to propagate fully without risk of containment and infection of the dimensional world. Yeah, that's enough about that. So next section, taxonometric drawings, which are basically drawings. That's the most basic definition. It's a drawing that, how should I describe it? A drawing that records its own processes, its own progress, and its notation as it emerges. So it's, if you'll humor me for a moment, it's a drawing not only of an object, not only of itself, but of the data of itself as it develops. Okay, there'll be a quiz at the end, so I want to make sure that you get all that information. So, a little anecdote here on how I kind of got interested in notational inquiry. When I was an undergrad at UNC Charlotte, I got a job for an architect during the summers, and I was doing working drawings, and I was kind of enamored by this really thick set of hand-drawn data. And I remember asking one of my professors when I got back, maybe it was second, maybe it was third year, is there an opportunity, or can we ever take the information, the text and the notation that's not part of the building but that's part of the drawing, and impregnate that information back on the building? Wouldn't that be kind of a cool concept? And I think they said, forest ranger. No. Forest ranger maybe is what you want to try. So, okay, I packed that away and went to grad school at UCLA, and we were working on CAD drawings, but we were still producing these data sets, and I remember asking one of my professors, what if we turned off every line that was building and just kept the notation and then collapsed them back on itself? Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And yeah, plumber. I'm not sure this architecture thing's going to work out for you so well. So this idea of kind of collapsing the data of a drawing on top of itself, I really kind of started to question the singularity of authorship and architectural image in the last year or so. This drawing in particular was a response to the challenge of the notion that an individual might be able to possess the formal characteristics of shape making and have a graphic style, which is always an interesting and a dangerous conversation to get into. So this drawing is attempting to kind of chart this kind of fabricated piety of false investigators, and started to question the conditions of authorship within a discipline that is really based on formal propriety. At the same time, it was kind of a syncopated chronological sample of architecture the physical nature of the project is to constantly change. So therefore, it is constantly evading form or definition. So this idea of linguistic authorship transforms on a daily, if not an hourly basis. So this drawing was meant to ask the question, if the proposed project or the proposal to the identity, it's a proposal to the identity of non-form, how might one categorize or record the plasticity of such an identity within the singularity of drawing? It was also probably more so an experiment of using a previously designed architectural entity as a metric for graphic investments. I was trying to deconstruct the prototypical data of 3 entities simultaneously, and we talked about this earlier in one of the classes, the idea of the project, the object, and the drawing. So I think it's somewhere between these 3 conditions lies the truth of the taxonometric drawing and the nature of this postliminal fuzz that I've talked about. So the taxonometric drawing becomes about none of these conditions by itself. I don't think it can. And I think we already know the parameters per se of any of those categories. So for example, the architectural project, which you guys are probably working on, it kind of describes a solution, maybe an answer to a set of problems, but it's not the thing. It's the amalgamation of the issues that are both addressed and potentially not addressed in a solution. And then there's the architectural model, which is, I think, perhaps traditionally the most reductive, and one might argue the most truthful in terms of its architectural media. In other words, what you see is what you get. And I think in terms of this model, there was an attempt to describe the formal characteristics of a set of finite responses. Of course, the more esoteric and the more translucent the intentions of the model, the less questions that are answered in its reading. And again, this analogy is based on the traditional architectural model media, which I think is less of a novel, and it's more of a dictionary. And then to follow that analogy, the third component would be that of the architectural drawing, which traditionally it's kind of an instruction manual for the assembly and logical understanding of the project. Both the object and the drawing have typically served the project. What I'm attempting to do is allow each of these entities to occupy its own equal state of transmission within the realm of architectural media. So here I was attempting to kind of experiment with the factors that combined each of these 3 distinct systems within a condition of singularity, the drawing membrane. And not in terms of achieving singularity within the design. I think quite the opposite. This drawing kind of allowed for the unpacking of multiple sets of data to occur that are typically segregated, probably for the best interest of everybody involved. And so it kind of discharges intelligence of the contradiction and conflict. It looks at the overlap and sympathetic relationships, as well as the emergent circumstances that occur when these 2 typologies are probably disharmoniously occupying the same physical membrane of the drawing surface. And so it's kind of begat some other experiments. This particular one was attempting to unearth the kind of residual liminal space between positions as a building object that what does this do? It traverses the flatness of the page. It kind of functions like a modern day Ouija board. It locates fantastical paths of a projected graphical landscape. I think the orange drawing that we carefully coordinated to match the color of your school is kind of the more finalized version of this. Happens to be the color of the front door of my new house. It just, it's all kind of wrapping up in too neat of a package. But the notation residue generated kind of increases like you can't see the drawing on the left. Looks like it might be a little washed out. It's kind of the fuzz factor. So this device creates layers of the self-read of the drawing. It's another example of the taxon drawing, or in this case, it's a hybrid that exists between the project and the objects and the drawings. So it's again, there will be a test on this. It's a project that generates an object that produces a drawing of its intentions and behaviors. I'm sure you have all that. The next to the last category is the postgenerative drawing, or what I'm calling after drawings. Initially, kind of in a prototypical process, a drawing might precede a project. It's a method of quickly exploring the initial ideas of an architectural intention. The drawing typically allows for kind of the fertile exploration of ideas and promotes the emergence or the extrapolating of new ideas as the image is added to and as it's manipulated. And it's interesting, though, because drawing as a tool kind of reemerges during the life of an exploration, but it typically doesn't show its face again until the end of a project, and it's usually disguised as a rendering. And so I suggest that in my world, very small world, there's a fundamental difference between rendering and drawing. In this case, rendering is suggestive, as I talked about in the palimpsests, as the termination of ideas. It's about distinctiveness, and it's about the finality that I talked about. But drawing suggests for me a continuance, a kind of freedom that allows, if it actually doesn't promote growth and change, it endorses multiplicity over singularity. These particular drawing typologies that are developed after the investigation of an architectural object, I think have reached a level of completion, and that's where we sort of enter the category of the post architectures. They typically reinvestigate issues that were developed, possibly abandoned or discussed in a separate but tangential layer of a project. I think that they also kind of assist in my attempt at understanding the potentials rather than the conclusions of much of my architectural work. And that's not to say that they're not part of the architectural work. It's just sort of a layer of when they happen. So I think you can probably tell I'm much less interested in defining or confining architecture than I am trying to add fuzzy layers to its already kind of thickened shell. And I think these are obviously most easily conducted in the medium of an experimental drawing. So the way I initially approach a post-architectural drawing, which I guess it's kind of a misnomer because any part of the exploration or the journey of a project is part of its complete makeup. So it's not really post-architecture, it's just architecture. But since this lecture was supposed to be about classifications, we can maybe return to that. So then, the way I might start these is to conceptually allow the drawings to harvest ideas that have emerged as the project develops. I mentioned that before, they could range from discarded ideas, often they're edited bits, they're tangents about the projects that popped up during its evolution. They're often distorted ideas that were uncovered by the fluid process of the drawing itself, and obviously as well as the metrics of not only the object, but the metrics of the drawing and the process itself, because I tend to deconstruct those. We were talking about in Mark's studio a little while ago about the deconstructing of the object and the drawing. It's kind of a very similar exercise of looking at the object and the subject of the drawing, but the drawing itself as a physical entity. And these things often become little footnotes that kind of emerged along the way of unpacking themselves, I guess. I think they're also a way of generating data sets that start to behave like geometry collectors. In that sense, they begin to generate graphic strategies of both the object, which is ironically the subject of the drawing, as well as the drawing itself. And these typologies are initiated long before the emergence of the taxonometric drawing, although I think they're surely its ancestor. And I guess they're basically simply ways for me to, and I guess methods for me to understand a given or project proposal at a much deeper level, instead of sort of calling it a day once the project is over. And I will go out and say that on probably many levels, the rules of these exercises might be too personal for mass distribution, because the codification is not really normative in its deployment, but they sometimes whatever the next project is to become resonant with the previous project's discoveries as well as its shortcomings. I think they're also a really neat way of untidying these kind of neat packages of models that are the default output of a proposal. And I understand that this has to be done. The nature of a proposal is to suggest a believable constructability and kind of a fabricated knowledge of construction, feasibility, and budget management, if you will. So in other words, the architectural object, which is arguably the product of the architectural studia and proposal, must by industry definition be somewhat a concise document for understanding. And if you take that definition then I think these post-architectural drawings become the antithesis of that legibility that I was talking about. In that sense, they become devices for misunderstanding. They are done as an attempt to redefine and hopefully kind of open the core of the discipline to a little wider stance, and hopefully the nature of architectural space and then its kind of its internal dialogue as well. This kind of emergent drawing typology is simply a system that creates nodes that will emerge into secondary investigations. For those of you that were present in the gallery walkthrough we did, that very first drawing that I was talking about sort of these the surface applicants, this is a similar kind of drawing. These nodes emerge into secondary investigations, and they tend to develop into kind of tertiary proposals. It's the idea of removing a parasite from the host and restructuring it to become a new host. So it's, again, a quiz, drawing a drawing that produces other drawings that themselves initiate yet further drawings. I'm sure that's quite clear, right? So if we take one of these little nodes physically and we allow them to sort of come up on the fruition of itself, you can see a rare kind of glimpse into the linearity of how some of these things might work. This was done, so this is the social amplifier project I did a couple of years ago, right after the Trayvon Martin trial, about looking at the kind of the truth that may or may not be found in social media and ambient awareness. So these social amplifiers attempted to create environments that promote kind of an ambient social awareness, the same way that drones provide an external awareness of a condition that's not occupied by its operator. It suggests that a social media may in fact be drones of awareness. It allows us to plug into social events that we are not actually there, but we become voyeurs and therefore contributors and therefore participants. And I think it has an opportunity to assign a conscious to kind of a soulless system. It's a chance to start mapping the synthetic condition of segregation. And for me, I started looking at where might we locate those segregation points. We've got a world that's kind of expanded past the borders of our own physicality and physically imposed culture into the culture of media. How do we start drawing points of social diversion, which is what the diagrams were attempting to do that were done as a post-architectural drawing of the amplifier. Or more to the point, maybe how these artificial points of segregation and social diversion are always in a state of being redrawn, redefined instantaneously based on our saturated culture of input. When you've got that little green dot of status availability and you turn it off, what happens to the nature of the group? It kind of redefines and redraws itself quite instantly. So I'm very interested, and I was interested with this project about those boundaries of the artificially constructed, and then therefore the kinds of machines or the type of devices that might inscribe those lines of division. In terms of the plan, it's archetypically been the initial instrument for calculating, projecting, testing, and documenting shadows as an architectural stimulus and response. I'm sure most of you guys are aware of this. But I think shade is a really interesting phenomenon within the condition of the architectural drawing. Many of all the, if not all the entities in this typology are meant to show what is and what will be there. There being a very elusive term in metaphysical space. Where is the there in a plan? I mean, if you think about it, where is the there within the artifact of the drawing? Shadows don't show what's there. They actually show what's not there, or that which is kind of partially absent. It's the removal of light through the synthetic assembly of kind of a construction hypotheses. It's actually quite a tragic story. The architectural shadow is a result of the failed journey of light rays that travel over 92 trillion miles, only to be denied their climax at the last moment of their journey. We do such a disservice to light when we make the architectural plan and we cast shadows in it, if you think about it. However tragic that is, I think it also provides one of the most poetic devices found within the plan. The transitory nature of the shadow is typically suppressed and condensed into a singular moment of time. This object casts this shadow at this time on this date. Instead of the durational aspect that transcends the static nature of kind of this depiction. In this particular drawing, the experiment was to serve as kind of a metric for the constant shifting between the horizontal and the vertical hybrid moments of a shadow's kind of mutable paths. So if you ever watch time-lapse photographs of a shadow, it's constantly moving horizontal, then it catches vertical, then it catches horizontal, then it catches vertical again. So it's actually not a singular static event. It's a very, I call them topography scanners. This particular project, the urban brothel, or as we were laughing about it earlier, it's called the horchata, as well as the drawing generated, they're both trying to establish and accept and record the factual condition that shadows are indeed scanners of the surfaces of sight and context. So as I mentioned, since it is a topography scanner, this particular bird's eye view, I guess you could call it that, was selected because of the kind of easily recognizable tracking of shadows as an object delineator, as well as the idea that the horchata's condition of a program-driven movement, the building actually rotates based on its physical and its physical functional conditions. The drawing tracks the significant program positions, and it uses distortion of the residue found between those positions to deposit planimetric reservoirs of ink, which is the architect's device for demonstrating the prevention of environmental illumination. So both the building and the drawing serve as multiple circumstances of chronologies. Each of them frames the temporal nature of both kind of typically segregated subjects. And then the experimental nature of this drawing typology allows for these entities that are normally, while they exist in tandem, they tend to be isolated graphic commands and imprints. So the last section, if you're awake with me so far, thank you. So the Datascape typology, excuse me, it's literally a topography of fluctuating intelligence. It kind of serves as both a figurative metric for depletion projections as kind of well as to animate the membrane of the cloud. So I'm going to close with these two projects that I think illustrate this idea of the fluctuating datascape. The first is the swarm draw, and the second is the ozonic bladder anomaly. So do a quote. I presented a paper at the Bartlett a couple years ago at the Drawing Futures Conference, so I want to read a little excerpt from that. In Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll described a synthetic world of immersion and constant transformation. In it, he labeled a series of indicators or totems that not only dictated a shift of scale, context, and orientation, but that also indicated graphically their intended use of the observer. Me and drink me were the documented instructions. They event or type of deconstruction that would transpire. They only demonstrated a set of instructions for their improper. These were graphic instructions for transformations through interactions, which is the nature of the swarm draw or the self-generating drawing. So to extend Carroll's eat me, drink me, I came up with the draw me, which is a set of self-referential instructions or embedded code that promotes the drawing's transformation by the occupancy and the interaction with the reader or the drawer. I think if you simply state that it's an interactive drawing, there's not really a full depiction. The Draw Me attempts to take this at many levels. It's not so much as a map as it is an immersive environment with never repeatable outcomes. You might define a map as a graphic segregation of drawing and reality, where this is the purposeful blending of the two. A map traditionally is not altered during the course of your journey. This entity requires change at every spatial and temporal shift. And this is part of the paper as well. In 1995, Marcus Novak wrote a very impactful paper, Trans Terra Form, Liquid Architectures and the Loss of Inscription. It's an excellent essay if none of you have read it. Within this critical text, he described a future condition of architecture and its adjacent extreme intermediums, that of liquid architecture, navigable music, and inhabitable cinema. These conditions described a spatial occurrence that was operable by the user or occupant, thus changing the singularity of both experience and navigation. So I was suggesting that the next component within this line of thinking might be the architectural drawing. It's a preface to a built world, or at least the formal arrangements and contracts that suggest experience over or instead of buildability. And I think both of these settings settings share a common factor. It's this condition of occupancy, which is either implied or demonstrated. It's my contention that a tangential next phase of these intermedia might be that of the editable drawing. So it's a new category. I've also kind of talked about it as being the occupiable drawing, since it's an hypothesis which suggests that the drawing arena is no longer confined to this dimensionally reduced planar two-dimensional system. I also submit that this new condition transforms from intermedia to entermedia, because the proposition rests on the viability and experiential anomalies found within virtual reality, perhaps requiring full sensual, if not spatial immersion. So if you imagine being, according to your physical visual receptors and recorders, fully absorbed into an experimental drawing, where the historical prison of the single plane is trapped representation experimentation for a long time. So the experience was thought of to be a very disorienting place, where that history becomes altered, thus affecting the kind of the trajectory of its possible futures. I'm going to get back to the postliminal fuzz idea for a second. So this project, it's kind of an epilogue that was a resultant from an ongoing collaborative project we did with a small team from the University of Kentucky. Did any of those make it tonight? No, Marty told me he was going to try to make it. So it was done with Marty Summers and a couple of his grad students, so University of Kentucky. We've been developing a series of what we call drawings of impossible objects for about a year. That was, I think, kind of probably the latest iteration of the collaborative effort. The idea was to pursue this drawing as a virtual reality experience, not just as an opportunity to kind of explore the spaces found within the dense drawing, what we were calling thick data, but to try to create an environment of disorientation. The idea is it would be a perplexing space that would be a responsive drawing environment. It's completely immersive and mostly adjustable by the occupant. And then it would also create new drawings as each user moved through and manipulated the thick drawing data. So the idea was that a residual drawing would be projected to become a kind of set of graphic baggage that would accumulate with the observer and the occupant as they started to dance with the drawing components. So each set of geographic and geometric notation would aggregate with this disembodied movement within the environment. And in this particular construct, the inhabitant and the draftsman became part of the graphic world system, so that every interaction node started to impregnate its information back onto the parasite as it traveled, populated, and manipulated the drawing. The idea being not only could the occupant restructure the drawing by line or shape or form interaction, but they would each also produce their own unique user notation drawing based on their interface. So it was sort of a cookies-based structure of spatial engagement. Excuse me. So according to Robin Evans, anyone reviewing the history of architectural theory would have to conclude that architects do not produce geometry, but rather consume it. And in this post-liminal drawing space, architects actually become the geometry. So the idea is that the maker and the consumer become singular in their possessive and their immersive experiences. I have to do this a lot, I apologize. The ozonic bladder anomaly, it's basically a synthetic membrane. It's a physical entity where 1 cubic yard of swelling occurs for every cubic yard of depleted ozone. So it's an exchange system. The expansion is also based on the amount and the concentration of social media traffic. So it breathes with each log on or use activity. So it's kind of functioning as a media metric. So the backstory behind this, when I first moved to Los Angeles in 1988 for grad school, I think to the best of my recollection, there were 2 main area codes for the surrounding territories. 213 was for Los Angeles and 714 was for Orange County. Mobile phones were an anomaly back then, if they were present at all. Fax machines were just starting to enter the consumer market. They were still a bit of a novelty. And the web as a consumer accessible entity hadn't been born yet. I think currently the number of area codes for that same Los Angeles, Orange County region, somewhere between 11 and 13, depend on your district mapping. So the idea is with massive increases in population and our requisite to always be connected with our smart devices, this kind of need and mandate for technology space has increased in the most dramatic results in recent history of human consumption, or at least its documentation and its physical support structure. So then we enter the protocol for an ever-expanding vehicle for data and linkage. I think it's somewhat ironic because the idea of the layer of bandwidth accretion has created kind of a fullness of data transfer and social disengagement. It creates a conceptual and quite impactful layer of information discharge. So the project, it's basically a conceptual space of protective layering. It starts to inquire how the rupture might be recognized, how it might be labeled, and kind of reimagined within our age of media saturation. So it's really a proposal for an ozone metric and plugging system. We're merging with the reduction of our strata with the accumulation of data space, also responding to the demand, the ever-increasing demand for the aggregation of bandwidth. We need more information, we need it faster. So at the same time we're depleting a natural resource, we're kind of increasing a synthetic resource. So the prognosis is a physical need to fill the increasing surface rupture of the ozone. Information technology kind of inclination to hypothesize the dramatic increase of a need for media space and all its ubiquitous outlets and inputs. In an architectural hypothesis, it basically serves two main functions. So it physically measures, calculates, and fills the cavities that will continue to tear open in our ozone. And then secondarily, it critically measures, records, maps, and projects our rapidly increasing technology, media engagement, and uses. So it's a cognizance machine. So it's an observatory, it's a recording device, it's a mobile transmitter for sure, but it becomes a billboard, it's an advertising agency, it's a bit of conceptual duct tape and bondo. It is a physician, a scientist, a lab manager, a plastic surgeon, and a counselor all wrapped into one. But it's also a soothsayer. It's a mimic, it's an impersonator, and I think perhaps most poetically, it becomes a political and a social band-aid. And in that case, maybe it's just described best as a messenger. It's kind of a conscientious objector. It is not an architecturally resolved project, but it's more of a kind of a herald of inquiry. I think to put it in very basic terms, it expands to fill the holes in the ozone. It expands to measure and increase the amount of consumptive communication. The idea is that the object that I showed would be one of many hundreds of thousands of cells within a sadly needed expanding network. Eventually, these would expand to a maximum volume, kind of linking and merging with adjacent anomalies until the new ozone would be a completely artificial construct. So therefore, both physically and conceptually, it becomes the cloud. It also becomes a floating laboratory of the non-shape, which is what the previous drawing kind of alluded to. So the amorphic shape, it highly fluctuates. The images that I'm showing assume that it only has these exact shapes at only one moment in time, and it has the ability of morphing constantly as the ozone and media projections change over longer periods. So in that sense, it becomes a measure of the chronology of progression in thought, if you will. And even though it's designed to to evolve to full capacity and implementation, it is hoped that its ability to reduce both the number as well as volumes might reflect an awareness and hope for its ultimate goal, which would be its decommissioning. If it does its job and we as humans stop destroying the ozone, it doesn't need to be there. So it's an odd architectural project that hopes that it actually never has a chance to fulfill its kind of ultimate destiny of becoming the cloud. I think it becomes a bit of a palimpsest itself. It's basically conceived to be drawing or writing in or on the invisible layer of atmospheric membrane. It kind of ultimately masks traces of the existing, kind of identical to the way that drawing on the drawing replaces data based on an existing context. And I want to attempt to distinguish the representation from the presentation for a moment. In this case, the the space between the model of the architecture and the architectural suggestion of a reality. This was one of the first models I did that attempted to wear a similar hat as to some of the drawings, being a simultaneous set of entities where temporality and geography were no longer at a one-to-one relationship, where the object studied was through the camera lens and the overlay of diagramming. And I was hoping to figure out a way in the composition to kind of deal with the surreal misalignments of the players. So there's 3 segregated entities in the models. There's the bladder lab, the docking station, and the tree hugger. Each of these existed in a world of the architectural project, but they're not in the same position or adjacency or time that the model suggests. And so I think just as my experimental drawings overlap non-adjacent elements, tweaked chronologies, and the multiplicity of scales, so was the attempt of this artifact. So in a sense, it represents conditions of exteriority, positioning, and timing. So it becomes a distorted and fractured timekeeper. And there's a new typology kind of device that inhabits the drawn object. And so this minor project, the tree hugger, was born out of this experiment. It was a series of experiments that explore the nature of architecture as both a literal and symbolic reading device. And so it kind of remaps the analog drawing data onto a formal digital diagram. It's a device that operates between 2 systems, so that of the natural environment and its occupants, trees. So that's the first environment. The second is the synthetic, which is the Southern California cell tower mimic. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Southern California, but we're heavily populated with the things on the left, which are they're cell towers, they're tree mimics, right? So there's an attempt at graphically making a synthetic device that somehow harkens back to the natural device so that we don't know what's going on, because you certainly can't tell that those things are artificial. So I'm trying to kind of map the area between those two. And even though you can argue that I guess the green nature of Southern California landscape itself is synthetic, the condition of the flora is a condition that reflects its biological condition. So this is kind of an initial pass at the tree hugger. As I mentioned, it's a scanning appliance. It surveys deforestation maps, cell tower location diagrams, archival texts that kind of record haunted archaeologies of landscape reconfigurations, power line boulevards, and plots of topography legislation. It's a very political machine in that sense. And so it inhabits a space between the physical membrane of the drawing and the intellectual zone of its legibility. It also attempts to map the parallels and contradictions of the residual space and artifacts between those systems. So just a couple more images here. I produce a lot of artifacts. I am a maker. I do this not in the sense of creating documents of successful experiments. I think they're more akin just to a body of work that without this kind of cataloging that I've been trying to do, it becomes much too intense of a blur for me to have them make any sense. So and we were talking with students about this earlier today, it's kind of an internalized set of rules that governs the typology in which you might work, in which I work, which allows me to attempt to create a little order from this otherwise kind of chaotic machine. And I think if you look at the notational space of the postliminal fuzz and the taxonometric drawing catalogs, they're actually systems of categorization in their own right. I think at some point several years ago I decided to attempt to classify my work in the same way that I classify occurrences that were happening within the drawings, which is an intense, albeit highly internal system of structure that makes sure that everybody's playing by the same rules, even though those rules are incredibly fluid and responsive by nature. So I'm going to read a little statement for this last section. The taxonometric condition is one of expressed self-classification. The drawing typology attempts to discover, break down, configure, expose, and reformulate the discussion, the very nature of the process of construction, the conceptual underpinnings of the work, the twisted chronologies and fabricated histories, and the graphical exploration of a given moment, object, or architectural event. Classifying one's work attempts to do the very same thing. It's a crack at unfolding, deciphering, and understanding or misunderstanding the conditions that make up a scope of invention. Without this internalized understanding, the work either ceases to be progressive within its context. For example, the work starts to become incredibly repetitive and predictable and thus denies the pleasure of emergent conditions, or it becomes an empty exercise of stylization. Both of these conditions scare me quite a bit in my work. I think there's an inherent fear of oversaturating myself with the same basic set of ideas. It's not about keeping fresh for the sake of freshness, but it's done under the realization that the presence and stagnation is kind of antithesis to creative energies. We were talking about producing a body of work in Mark's studio, that you have to put the investment into making the work to sort of pull these ideas out of it. So to make work and then to classify your work and its emergent properties, I think is to make paths for future work or work beyond its immediate scope. Last little bit, and then I'll turn the lights on. So the emergence of this category or classification occurs either at the same time or it's usually post-production. The taxonometric drawing, for example, this terminology, it's probably been evolving over the last 5 to 7 years in my studio, but I only really labeled it about a year and a half ago. Because I think it's about the generation of the lexicon or perhaps a series of sub-lexicons in order to navigate the projects and their agendas. So the question might be to see if the context is my studio formula or it's found instead within each project, each drawing, each object. And I tend to question whether the relics are individual lexicons themselves or in fact they're artifacts and maps to the larger lexis of the studio. So I'm going to end this not with a conclusion, but much closer to the nature of the work itself with yet one more unanswered question. I thank you for your attention. And your consciousness for some of you. That's greatly appreciated as well.
Thanks, Bryan. Will you take questions?
Yes, yeah.
I'm just going to flip the lights.
Sure, yeah.
I hope there are questions. Bryan's flight
They're going
leaves.
for more pizza. Yeah.
Bryan's flight leaves at 11 a.m., so if we can finish the questions before that, that would be great.
A couple hours, that would be nice.
Yeah, you have to talk into the microphone so they can pick it up on their recording.
Hi, Bryan. On your Instagram and your other works, I see a lot of both digital and analog drawings, and both of them, so your analog drawings have a very sort of digital quality, whereas your digital drawings will have a very organic analog quality. So I'm really curious to hear how you consider those two mediums, if they are different from each other, or how that fits into your process of drawing altogether.
You know, it's an interesting question. It sounds like I'm doing it wrong. If the analogs are reading as digital and the digital reads analogs, I think I need to reinvestigate my whole studio. I'm going to make a note of that right
Oops.
now. I guess it would be interesting. I'd be curious how you define digital, looking digital and looking analog. I don't subscribe to kind of the conventions of what that might be. They're certainly using different tools to construct, but they're still tools that are moving towards kind of a central idea or a way of working. I tend to draw digitally the same way I draw analog. One's faster, one allows one promotes erasure, one kind of avoids it, one masks it very well, one is impregnated with everything so you can't cover up your mistakes. I've never heard anybody sort of describe the analog drawings having a digital quality. Again, I'm not sure what that means, or the digital drawings kind of having this organic analog quality. I'm not sure how to answer that.
I think they're very fluid between each other, and I think that's my way of trying to express that fluidity.
Yeah, my first book, Makudzu, was kind of based on the principle of fluidity. So I grew up in North Carolina in the South, and I don't know if you guys have it here, the kudzu vine. All right, so you understand it, right? So I grew up around a bunch of tobacco warehouses and industrial buildings, and I would, over the course of my youth, would watch the kudzu grow and invade and deconstruct buildings. and grow on top of power lines and jump over roads and things. So the idea of mech kudzu is that it's just a marriage of mechanical and kudzu. So it's the organic growth of mechanical synthetic entities, and that's kind of been the philosophy of my studio. So I think the drawings are residual outputs of that kind of a philosophy. I'm not sure I understand the question, so I don't know if I've addressed it, but maybe that helps frame it a little better. I'm gonna have to think about that one on the plane. That's interesting. Yeah, I actually would like, maybe you can let Mark know. I'm really curious as to what your definition of have digital quality, analog quality. Because usually from lectures at schools, we don't have a conversation about analog quality. We just have a conversation about analog versus digital. So I'm really intrigued about your access point about what that actually means. I think that's an interesting kind of larger conversation to have. So you can write an essay and submit it to Mark, and I'll read it. Yeah, that'd be awesome. That's great, actually.
Hello.
There you go.
So you talked a lot about drawing on drawings. So, and you mentioned that you reach a state of completion sometimes. So how do you decide when you've reached a state of completion? And how would you feel if someone did palimpsest drawings on your drawings?
Did we talk about this morning?
No.
Maybe? Yeah.
Maybe touched on it.
That's the question that's always asked in the lectures. Okay, so specifically for the palimpsest drawings, I've established a set of rules and objectives that I want the drawing to cover. Those are complete, if there is such a word, when that particular investigation I feel has been answered within that drawing. And I think we were maybe talking about it this morning. Right now there are 9 of them. I've only sort of stepped back and look at all 9 of them as a whole. We're preparing, I've got a solo show in Hollywood coming up in a month, and so we're starting to frame them. And I haven't really stepped back and looked at them as a whole. But you can see an evolution of the intensity and the saturation of information and the kind of moving away from an integral building component to segregated smaller components, and then how it's starting to project graphic information on the drawing. So even that parameter has started to evolve over the life of the drawing. So I think for me, specifically with those, is when I feel that that question has been answered within that given drawing, that's when I stop. The joke is when there's no more room to draw lines on there, then they have to be done at that point. But conceptually, drawing number 1 has to be done before drawing number 2 happens, which has to be done before drawing number 3. So in that sense, as a series, they're not complete, and they never will be complete, because I do drawing number 1, I analyze it, I study it, I rip it apart, I critique it, I understand what it does and doesn't do, and I hopefully address the original issues plus those issues in drawing number 2. And then I do the same thing over and start with drawing number 3. I think as a generic answer is when I feel that the issues that were either set out at the beginning of the project or that have evolved during the life of the project are answered, that's when I stop. I don't think of any of the work being finished. I think some of the work is presentable in terms of discussing the idea, but I mean, I could easily spend another 5 years on one drawing, just removing parts that I don't think are needed anymore. Yeah, then it becomes sort of a masturbatory exercise at that point, and that's not good for anybody. So that's maybe how I would answer that, if that makes any sense.
On to the Lewis Carroll aspects, just because he had a way of creating his own language as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in his case, he had the assistance of really easily digestible illustrations. So like in the poem of the Jabberwock, you don't know what a Jabberwock is, but you see the illustration and you can go along with the story. So while you're creating these sort of new visual languages, along with these definitions of interstitial spaces and things, how do you see them being digested by people who are kind of learning this language? Or is this more of kind of like a personal language that, as a thought process to kind of help move through things, move through ideas?
Are you saying these are not digestible, legible drawings? It's okay. They're not meant to be. So that was. Yeah, I've done this before. That particular project was a quote that established the idea of the inhabitable drawing. The graphics that I showed during that part of the lecture, I don't have access to create a virtual reality drawing. I don't have the hardware. I don't have the technical know-how. I don't have the financial support. So those were all constructs that I generated to sort of illustrate of what the Jabberwock might be. It's just a hypothesis. I don't know if it would actually look like that. But that idea is interesting because if every one of you guys went through that virtual drawing and that inhabitable drawing and that editable drawing, it would change every time somebody went through it. And you guys would, I think I showed a picture of Pigpen from Charlie Brown. I don't know if you guys knew that character, but he sort of collected dust everywhere. That's what would happen with you. You'd collect all this information based on how you navigated the drawing landscape. And then that information you would impregnate back on the drawing. So it would never be the same drawing twice. So in terms of, would it be legible? I hope not. That was the objective behind it. And it stopped as a hypothesis because for me there's no way to test it out. But they're actually doing the same thing. They were trying to illustrate what that, you don't know what the Jabberwock is, but so this is what a version of it looks like. And so those were sort of passes as to what those might look like. I have no idea if that's actually what they would be. Actually, I would think probably not because that's me controlling it, and I think these things would be, I wouldn't control it. I would control the parameters, but I would control the graphic residuals. Does that make sense? Okay. Did that answer your question? So in terms of information that beginning people might understand, I don't know if I understand them, to be quite honest with you. They're meant to establish, in all seriousness, they're meant to establish a dialogue and a discourse and to evoke the act of inquiry. So if you're looking at them and asking questions about them, then that's how I might rate them complete, to answer the first question. Then they're doing their job as an artifact of architectural discourse. If one person in here, maybe it's you, maybe it's not, looks at architecture and drawing slightly different, then it has been successful. Sure.
Bryan, thanks a lot for that. I mean, just to kind of sit back and have someone talk about work that's so intense and so pleasurable is a gift on its own. So my threshold's even lower than yours. Doesn't even have to impact one person. Just seeing someone so, kind of into it is its own gift. My question is really about the supposed inevitable end game of the work of the architect, which is the building. Mm-hmm. And I love here that you've unsettled that kind of dictum, if you will, So here you've kind of asserted the drawing to take the place of that inevitable end game. But I'm curious, just in your own trajectory, how close you got to being lured into the building, right, and the thing itself. And are you dissatisfied with the buildings that you see or the buildings that you think about? And therefore that's part of what's driving this, or how do you sort that out?
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of a take on how to frame the work. I have been, well, I've generated some architectural projects which generate architectural artifacts. Am I satisfied with those as objects? I think to a certain extent, but it also bugs me that there is a condition of finality. Have I been affected by the buildings that I have worked on? I think if I had found them to be successful, I would be doing more building and I wouldn't be doing more drawing. We had this conversation several times during the day-to-day, it's kind of a worn-out conversation, but the difference between building and architecture, especially in the studio that we were in at the end, right? I think I'm highly dissatisfied. That's what's pushing the work. And the end game is a really good terminology because I don't think it. I purposely am looking at the start game, which is the drawing. I mean, this is how I was educated. You start with a sketch, you start with the drawing, you develop it, you develop the model, and the project emerges. Then you might do rendering. So it's a very clean, linear system. But that's always bugged me, right? Because it does talk about the condition of finality. And I think in our discipline, one of the worst things that we can do is to close the book or to kind of put the period at the end of the sentence on any kind of investigation. I think I'm in a minority on doing that, but I think it's in the sense of your question, it might be kind of a protest of that condition of finality or the end game. I see, especially out in Southern California, because building is exploding most of the time. Very, very little of it is architecture, and I know some of the people that are generating this work. I know the factors that are populating that, and I guess it may be kind of maybe a protest is maybe kind of a harsh word, but it's a response to that condition of terminality that happens. I've attempted to do with students before. I think it would be an excellent studio is to find a non-architectural building and to produce a set of experimental post-architectural drawings based on that then we could go back and kind of reevaluate that. I know that can be done. I've done it before, and I've kind of worked with students before. So that would be an interesting, for me, I would find that a really interesting topic studio, to take the most banal kind of response that you can find, and how can you generate a set of artifacts from that would maybe make it, give it a new kind of legibility, and then maybe breathe life into kind of the discourse of the architecture. I don't know if I came close to answering the question or not, but.
2 years ago, Liam Young was here, and he showed, amazing movies. And he kind of made a political statement in the Q&A that he had abandoned the building as a site for architecture, and had moved his practice, exclusively into film or cinema or
right.
however you want to describe that, video production. There's lots of ways to describe it. And I was thinking, that was really provocative, but there was also a part of me that thought, wow, I want to experience buildings that are as rich
Absolutely.
as those films are. And, and your drawings have that, a kind of similar quality for me as his films, where on the one hand, I understand them as deeply architectural. That's not a question for me. But they do indict conventional practice, I think. And they indict buildings that, don't let us care, that careless buildings that don't let us care.
Absolutely.
And so I think it would be interesting to all of us to collect examples of buildings, for ourselves that we think have the same kind of intensity as work like this, and then see what that adds up to. Not a question.
I'm trying to. Thank you. We're talking about this is at breakfast this morning with Mark. I'm trying to generate a set. I think I showed a couple samples of them of what I'm calling the taxonometric object, which is kind of the next phase of the taxonometric drawing. So we produce this postliminal graphic fuzz, and I want to be able to sort of take that back in three-dimensionally and see if it can impregnate upon step one. Step two is alter and deform the building. I don't have the technology or the know-how. I've got a couple of, I guess you could call them assistants. One is in LA, one is in Germany, that kind of answered an open call. I was looking for interns, and we're trying to create kind of a live notation system that we can, of a specific architectural, the horchata, that we can sort of project back on itself and see if it can be transformed. And it might be a horrific experiment. Right now we're generating too many notations, and you have to kind of weed through them. But so I'm interested to see if the idea of a pre-drawing of a building and a post-drawing of a building could in fact affect the building itself. I mean, Eisenman kind of has done that to a certain extent, and that he actually planted a big seed when I was in undergraduate school about kind of looking at some of those ideas. And I'm not really sure how to take it further. I guess part of my charge is to kind of throw this information out there and seeing if the much younger, much more intelligent, much savvier. Students could pick up on that, and somebody kind of runs with the idea, and maybe we can see what happens with it. My studio is me. Every couple of years I get an intern to work with me, but it's pretty much me and a desk and this MacBook. So whatever this MacBook can do is what I generate. If it can't do it, which is a lot, I don't do it. So I think I've kind of hit a saturation point in terms of the volume of what I can produce in terms of a hypothesis. So I'm really anxious to see if students, kind of pick up on any of those ideas and how that might kind of manifest itself. Not in a one-to-one relationship, but yeah, that's not an answer, but you didn't ask a question, so I think it's okay. Yeah.
I see what you did.
Anyone else?
Thanks a lot. It was really engaging.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I'm curious because I think one of the things that you started with was the idea that there's a given, and that given is a set of conventions or it's a set of notations, or it's something that kind of derives from the nature of drawing itself.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case of the palimpsest, the prix de Rome, this kind of
Right.
thing that was very much about the public realm. So I wonder if you've thought about the idea of an open drawing, just like laying it out there and putting a PSD out there, a Photoshop document out there and letting people engage it.
Make it better?
No, just engage it. Like literally, if
Like
if
an
the
exquisite
idea-
corpse kind of?
Yeah, exactly like that.
I've experimented with that a little bit. It usually becomes, and I'm accused of creating dense drawings. It very quickly usually becomes so dense that it's like kind of the first image I showed. If I can do this, like that one, and that's borderline legible for me. It becomes that almost instantly, and then it just I think there's too many voices and too many issues. Now I have, it's a very interesting idea. I probably haven't done it in the correct way, but an exacerbation of that tends to happen rather quickly.
I feel like that's a kind of an idea of classifying something that has to do more with the Borges classification of the Chinese encyclopedia that Foucault talks about in his opening, and that's kind of where that ultimately goes, that the taxonomy of form is in and of itself a kind of incredibly complex object.
Again, another one excellent studio topic. I think this is a really good idea, actually.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I might take that myself.
Please do. Please do. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, let's call it there. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, guys.